Have you with us as well. Our next session is a panel presentation on the roles of international and supranational organizations in areas of conflict right around the world. And we have the work of three scholars on this panel. Right, we have Dr. Francois Vrey from Stellenbosch University of South Africa, who will speak first. And then we have a presentation of Dr. Maria Effendi from the National Defense University, Islamabad, Pakistan. Sadly, Dr. Effendi could not join us personally because of other commitments, but she did send on her paper and ask that I read on her behalf. And so I will attempt to do it justice and presenting her work for her. And then finally, Marilyn Andrews, PhD candidate from the University of Wisconsin, is here to talk about her work on indigenous rights, international cooperation in the Mapuche Nation of South America. And so, without further ado, we'll turn it over to our first speaker, and then we'll go in order right here on the panel list, and then we'll take some time for questions and answers at the end. Okay. So, everyone, Dr. Francois Vrey, Stellenbosch University.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and to the organizers for this opportunity. I'm still trying to cope with the jet lag. I should be sleeping now. This presentation about future maritime peacekeeping and taking it towards Africa, I looked at this, and what I found was that there were certain questions that I asked, given events that took place very recently and that are still ongoing off the coast of Somalia. And in this regard, I say that in terms of the background, the responses to piracy of the Horn of Africa highlights four security developments. So I try to look at it from the aspects or the prospects of globalization and the dynamics by means of a growing actor spectrum that we are seeing off the coast of Somalia, UN securitization of maritime threats to human and economic security, a positive international response to what the United Nations, in fact, are trying to do there, a surprising response, as a matter of fact, and then that we are looking at indicators of emergent maritime peace support off the coast of Africa. Right. In this regard, what I try to do is to take a look at this by first moving back in time and the matter of the broadened security debate that became so topical after the end of the Cold War, and particularly for Africa. And that we see here the attempts after the fall of the Berlin Wall in terms of the larger security debate to include previously neglected sectors of security, to bring them forward, give them more prominence, turning the attention to different sectors of security that were previously ignored, underexposed, or acknowledged, but they did not really receive much international attention as far as resources, etc., are concerned.
We need you in front of the microphone.
So what I try to do is to look at it through this lens as a departure about what we are looking at. And then in particular, of course, bringing in the individual. We've heard about human security quite a few times yesterday as a focus, and obviously as a competitive focus, because it's in fact competing with the whole idea that the most important entity of security that you should look after is the state, and that that competition is ongoing, and it's an open verdict about now who is in fact receiving most of the attention and the resources, etc. And then, of course, the other one about the rising debate about get your economics right and the rest of the stuff ought to fall into place. So, focusing security upon non-traditional sectors is an ongoing debate, and part of this is the matter about globalization. And then, if we look on the overhead to this side, a bit of a difficulty that stemmed from this. The one side appeared very popular, it appeared very attractive, but you have to securitize security threats because it's only by means of the securitization that you really draw an audience, that you draw attention, that you get into a position where you can allocate almost disproportionate resources towards what you deemed the threat to be, and therefore that you could implicate or go towards extraordinary measures in order to deal with that threat. But then you first have to tag it as a security threat, and then preferential in terms of a threat as an existential threat. And the difficulty with the broadening of the security debate is how do you bring certain of the new sectors forward in terms of an existential debate, and by means of securitization that you can go to disproportionate measures or extraordinary measures in order to deal with it. So that held a certain complication in terms of the actions that should follow, because if you securitize a security threat, and then everybody says, yes, it's very important, but something needs to be done about it. When we keep to the lens of globalization, one fact in terms of what we see is the whole idea of the growth in terms of actors that come to the security domain. And where previously you had that states and governments really dictated, had much to say, and they were the gatekeepers about what came in and had to be dealt with, things have changed. And I found this table rather informative that was done by Bellamy and Williams in the 2010 publication on matters of peacekeeping and complexities. And what it shows is just the increase in actors that you these days have to deal with, and most of them are rather influential. So we'll see that at the top, yes, we've got states with their governments, but look what's happening on this side and on this side. And these actors these days play very active, influential roles, and in many cases they are even more influential and stronger than many governments that find themselves by hook or by crook in that category. So this is something that has to be noted, because on the security landscape you now have these actors to deal with. But that's not the full story. If we look at this slide, that looks rather traditional. We recognize that, and maybe that forms part of a very ordered system where states with their institutions are set up, and they are structured and they function to deal with matters of threats and vulnerabilities. And of course, it's the way in which threats and vulnerabilities interact that ultimately plays out as security or insecurity. But if we look towards this side, we see that in terms of those actors, and there's an element of being subjective about this, these are so often those that bring insecurity towards the strategic landscape, and that they need to be dealt with by, let's say, the forces of order on that side. So whilst we can try to present it in this way, the real picture on the ground is not always so structured and ordered. For example, if we look at the security debate, we will find that some of the authors, like Barry Busen, for example, will tell us something that in the statutory part, where the states are, the state in fact becomes the biggest threat to society, to people in the country, and that you get certain cases where what you have on this side, they in fact defend the people. So it's not a clear-cut scenario that we are looking at. Nonetheless, in terms of globalization, what we have is that in terms of security, the sectors about drawing the attention to an expanded spectrum of sectors in terms of security, you have positive as well as negative impacts in these different sectors. And it's not difficult. I mean, one only has to look at the whole idea of your big, for example, your G8 conferences to see the images of what this represents about elements of satisfaction and elements of dissatisfaction. What the audiences that's being drawn about those that say, listen, globalization has these positive effects, and those that say, forget about it. A different argument is about the difficulties with globalization is that there's not enough globalization in order to have the benefits not being differential but being a type of universal. Fact of the matter remains then that you have these negative impacts. Part of it is, of course, having these new modes of political conflict that you have. And then on this side, if you look towards typically your internal conflict spectrum that you find in a number of countries, and in your developing countries in particular, that you would often find elements of these being listed as drivers or causes of why you have these conflicts in terms of different theoretical explanations by authors. But this complexity, if we could move closer towards the whole notion of peace operations, through the United Nations, one of the major, I almost want to say, vehicles to deal with the difficulties and the threats and violence by means of what happened in terms of the new security landscape, the whole idea of peace operations, of course, became very prominent. The traditional side of peace operation, your so-called barrier-style peace operations, were seen as very successful in a previous age. But the complexity, the approach to deal with a new security environment, conflicts, internal wars, etc., by means of your peace operations approach, very soon ran into certain difficulties about the complexity of the conflicts, the number of conflicts that they had to deal with, and then the availability of money and soldiers to do it, because you have to eventually do that. And that again gave rise to a type of a debate that tried to extend what peace operations, what they are all about, and trying to stretch the notion of peace operations by saying you need to have different types of operations for the kinds of threats that were accelerating so quickly. It became very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all because of the complexities that they suddenly had to encounter. Now, this is just two examples where the British came up with certain categories to try and have some kind of fungibility about how to react. And on the other hand, Bellamy and Williams came up with another range to say we need to extend, we need to be more specialized so that we approach different conflicts differently with a different type of model and a different type of attitude and how we allocate forces and resources, because they found that you allocate huge resources, you allocate forces, etc., and the benefits are rather disappointing. Now I want to turn to Africa in particular, a continent that contains numerous states, 52 states approximately, and operates in terms of its security dynamics to a large extent by means of different regions, ultimately to be gathered or to be moved in under the auspices of the African Union that is located up in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia as headquartered. So what is the image of Africa that we have? Alternative images that people, different groups will give you different answers. So is it a lost continent? Is it a continent in future that's going to look like this with a Chinese influence over much of the continent? And then, of course, what we have on here, the debate about Africa rising, about what Africa has to offer in terms of studies that try to demarcate this. Well, Africa is a continent that offers much in terms of resources, and especially in terms of the black bars, the oil that it offers, that it has become so important. And the interesting part is they are just discovering more and more and more oil on and off the African continent, in the Gulf of Guinea, for example. And the presentations we had about the problems that's going on here, it's only going to be complicated because as in the countries around Uganda, the lakes here, more very attractive oil deposits are being found. Africa and growth. This is an IMF diagram that one could access and you can play with it. But what it shows is about African economies growing after the economic decline of recent, starting to grow again, and then Africa finding itself between the growing economies, India and China, developed economies in Europe, the United States, and this side. So strategic location in this case is very important in terms of what is happening. The interesting part is in the active mode, you can shift this particular cursor over here, and it'll show you how the colors on the map changes about Africa and the economies and continents around it. People, we heard about the youth bulge in the previous presentation. Look at the concentrations of people in the Horn of Africa and over there, where the other difficulty in the offshore domain is busy unfolding with much about energy. But look at the huge population concentrations here, especially along the side here that is more relevant for this presentation. So in terms of Africa's threats, what is different? It's very easy to Google or to gather literature on African threats. But one thing that is different and that is emerging now is that the African threats, in terms of how they were traditionally presented, begins to show a maritime side as well. And that maritime side has much to do with criminality, even where states are involved, terrorism that you find towards West Africa and into the Horn of Africa, and the extent to which the sea becomes a pathway to enter into Africa, and otherwise where the sea becomes a domain to execute terrorism. I'll show you some images that I'll quickly run through just to illustrate that side of the maritime domain in terms of terrorism, because everybody knows about the bombing in Uganda on the eve of the Soccer World Cup final. Everybody knows about the bombings in Dar es Salaam in '98 and up into Kenya in 1998. But what is now becoming more visible is the fact that there's also a maritime dimension to this. Then, of course, you have piracy and oil bunkering in the Gulf of Guinea and off the Horn of Africa. The huge oil resources that are tapped into off the Nigerian coast and in the littorals there has drawn very unsavory elements, criminals, political movements, dissatisfied movements between criminality and insurgency that tap into the oil. And that is a huge problem in terms of what they do and working together with pirate tankers that lie off the coast deeper into the water. And Exxon and Shell and those companies incur huge losses because of this criminal activity that tends to fuse with your political movements there. Then drug trafficking, I'll show you an image about that, about how drug trafficking really takes place and flows into West Africa in particular as a new hub, as things become rather hot for the drug lords down into the Latin America, etc. You have organized crime, people that are being dealt with and smuggled, and then disputed maritime boundaries. So in terms of the images, I would just like to show you, this is something off the African coast about disputed boundaries in the Gulf of Guinea. So as the charge for oil becomes more intense, those boundaries are going to have to be settled, or they're going to most probably fight to settle those boundaries. Here we have flaring off the Nigerian coast that is illegal. That runs about drug trade routes that run into Africa and into West Africa in particular. Here we have elements of piracy that I'll return to. And this is a deep sea offshore offloading and storage facility in the Gulf of Guinea. It was 120 miles into the sea, and it was attacked by the Men movement 2 years ago. And it caused a major shutdown in terms of Shell. So that's the one side. This is just another one that I want to show you about attack on an oil tanker in the Red Sea. Although it's more to the other side, a little bit deeper into the Red Sea, attack on coastal traffic in the Gulf of Guinea. This is the piracy attack trying to help, and that is the post-piracy scenario, local population swamping the ship after the pirates left to take what's left. Now, peace operations, in terms of a maritime view, is a difficult topic, because the fact is that the United Nations, in spite of recommendations, never really got this off the ground. So when you look at peace operations from a naval perspective, you will find that there's a number of ways in which you can deal with threats that come from the sea. But as I'll try to indicate on this side, this is what you need to do, but you have different iterations of how successful it is and how navies can really do this to contribute, because navies now have to shift their roles. So the theory says, listen, you are really geared well to do that, but when you have to do it, there are certain problems that you have to deal with. So from a theoretical perspective, there is much said about it, lying out or placing out what you can do and what you cannot do and what becomes very difficult. So if we turn to Africa and we say, well, what we have of Africa, especially this big problem that emerged here over the past 3 years and into the Gulf of Guinea, but this is the one that drew most attention and the one that became securitized. What now? The United Nations decided that they have to do something in whichever way, realize the problem, their maritime responsibility is there, it's taken up in the United Nations. But what they did was they began to securitize that problem that I showed you by means of a number of resolutions. And what is interesting is that these resolutions first called for help to protect the World Food Programme, the ships bringing food to Somalia. Secondly, they needed greater cooperation when the piracy really became problematic. They came up with a second resolution to assist the transitional federal government, that is a very unstable government, and trying to get to grips with what is happening in Somalia, being recognized but really not having much influence beyond certain parts of Mogadishu. And they realized that they had to help them. Then another one, asking governments and countries for naval access in reiteration of UNCLOS, the law of the sea, to support that, because the problem just kept on growing disproportionately at sea. Then the use of acts of aggression against the ships and at sea to uphold maritime safety and navigation and to pursue and prosecute pirates that eventually get caught. And then special agreements with actors for the custody of pirates, because of the problem, You catch the pirates, you take them on board, and nobody wants them. So what do? Throw them overboard, put them back in their ship, take them to the coast and put them back on the beach, and tomorrow you catch them again. So in terms of the securitization that we saw here, in terms of the United Nations trying to deal with a very, very difficult problem, we saw the primary agency that took the lead in this offshore domain was the United Nations, under pressure or realizing they had to do something. And the threat that led to this securitization, believe it, was piracy in the Horn of Africa. Not in the Caribbean, in the Horn of Africa. Okay? Therefore, the object of security was people and the global economy, because of the huge displaced population that needed to be fed and kept alive through the ships coming in through the World Food Programme. And the global economy, the economic side of globalization has a very, very strong maritime side. And if you cannot maintain good order at sea in a crucial choke point, like through the Red Sea, into the Gulf of Aden, you shut down a major, major artery along which goods flow at sea, and that underpins a positive element of globalization. So, in a speech act, UN statements and resolutions took this much further in terms of securitization, and the audience was states, regional organizations, and alliances that began to respond to this securitization call by the United Nations. And the response or actions were the deployment of naval vessels, international cooperation that took place to capture the pirates. So if we want to, just as an image, show what the response was, you had the European Union, you had the NATO, you had the US Combined Task Forces, and you had individual countries sending large, very expensive and very scarce naval resources in response to a securitization call. So what could we say about this in terms of peace support off the Horn of Africa? Well, the UN interest in maritime peace support of the Horn of Africa tells us the following story. Human and economic security apparently caught the attention. Two of the less traditional and sectors that were not always received so well. We see a UN-flagged World Food Programme mission into Somalia they had to keep this going for humanitarian reasons. They had to back the transitional federal government in Somalia because that was the only symbol of government in that huge country. Beyond that, there was nothing. They had to support AMISOM, the African Union force in Somalia that stepped in after the Ethiopians left, because they are actively trying to back the transitional federal government, and if they are not there, well, who's going to help? And they are type of a running into the country in order for the United Nations perhaps to eventually follow with a hybrid force. So they're keeping the fort at the moment, and they needed to be supported. Then, of course, the idea of you have to get good order at sea back, because piracy immediately says to you, good order at sea is gone. And it has repercussions that we can speak very long about what it means. And then, of course, fighting terrorism, the flow of terrorists, the Al-Qaeda group that you have in the Arabian Peninsula being affiliated with the Al-Shabaab that is fighting in Somalia, and then the different affiliations that are coming with some pirate groups affiliating themselves with the government, the rumors about pirates affiliated with Al-Shabaab, and then, of course, if you read the narratives from Al-Qaeda's interest in the pirates that are operating off the coast. Although the pirates did not necessarily express their interest in Al-Qaeda, but the other way around, the narratives show the expression of, we really would like to have solidarity with the pirates. So this is all about securitizing to establish peace in the Horn of Africa, and that this peace support that is going on must come from the land and it must come from the sea at the moment. So in conclusion, what we are seeing is the rise of previously neglected sectors and agents of security that's taking place here. Globalization is a catalyst that causes or makes different actors more salient in terms of their visibility and how they influence events. So globalization obviously then is an agent of security and insecurity, as one of the previous slides indicated. But here we see the United Nations as a securitizing actor. And this gives rise to reconsidering maritime security of this very volatile country in the Horn of Africa. And we see the interplay of human and economic security, two, I think, very sensitive issues needing to draw attention and in need of securitization. So we see a UN interest here in securing a landward and an offshore entity or an offshore sector by means of its actions of securitization. And the most surprising about this is the way in which the international community responded, because the flow of naval assets towards the coast and into the Gulf of Aden to myself, that was very surprising given the fact that the idea of peace operations at sea is underdeveloped, it's very difficult, and it's very scarce and very, very expensive resources that you have to allocate in order to deal with this particular problem. And as I showed in that last slide about who responded, that in fact international society responded to the securitization by the United Nations and in fact allocated and deployed those scarce assets in order to defend human security and to defend a global economic asset being depicted as a global maritime trade route that runs through the Red Sea and down through the Gulf of Aden. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Marilyn Anders from the University of Wisconsin. So please welcome Marilyn. Sorry.
Hello. I just want to thank Grand Rapids Community College and the conference organizers for allowing me this opportunity, especially putting me in the same category as all these other wonderful presenters. I'm a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. My research involves the Mapuche, who are an indigenous group in the southern cone of South America, and I look at how they use the mass media as a means of self-representation. And I did my fieldwork during the past year, so I'm going to comment on that just slightly. But I'm not actually talking about the mass media today. Today I want to talk about some of the international and organizations that helped Mapuche in their struggle for self-determination and recognition of rights. So the Mapuche inhabit Walmapu, that's the native word for their traditional territory, which spans the Andes and actually encompasses two different countries, Chile and Argentina. And historically, as well as currently, they've been subject to harsh discrimination, the seizure of their traditional lands, and the impoverishment of their culture and their standard of living. So there's been some international initiatives which have helped, along with activity of the Mapuche organizations, to gain some of these recognition of their rights and regain some of their lands. But in most cases, the Mapuche people still remain inferior to other citizens. And what happens, the disputes they have with the government leave them feeling frustrated, helpless, and often they only have two choices, either to wait indefinitely for a resolution which may or may not ever come, or to turn to violence. So in this paper, I want to talk about some of these mechanisms that are intended to help their situation. And also, because I don't have a whole lot of time and I did most of my fieldwork in Chile, I'm going to focus on Chile, even though Mapuche are actually our nation that span two different countries. I'm going to focus on Chile and what happens there. So first, I'm going to talk about the UN and a couple of UN organizations, the International Labor Organization, and also the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and how they're involved in helping the Mapuche. And then I want to just briefly touch on the Chilean national law, especially the indigenous law. And then last, I want to talk about the concept of desarrollo, or development, which I think is an area in which cooperation and communication, or lack thereof, is actually responsible in a lot of cases for some of the disputes that happen in Chile. So, in the wake of World War I, there were two international bodies that were created. The first was the League of Nations, and the second was the International Labor Organization. The League of Nations, in terms of indigenous rights, was pretty useless because the member states too effectively prevented underrepresented minorities from access to the forum. And the League of Nations didn't last very long. It kind of fell apart in the 1930s, and then was replaced by the United Nations in the midst of World War II. And after World War II, the political climate was actually very amenable to begin addressing issues of indigenous rights. And some of those reasons are concerns over fascism, where if countries couldn't be trusted to provide and protect their own citizens, that was concerning. Also, the dismantling of the European colonies, and if the European states couldn't be trusted to safeguard human life and dignity, then colonial governments could be trusted even less. And then also the practice of forced education as a means of trying to assimilate indigenous population was evident that wasn't working, and that's like the boarding schools that existed in the U.S. and Canada. And then lastly, there were just a lot of NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. There were a lot more created after World War II. So the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, has been consistently the first international organization to address issues of indigenous rights. And originally, they were framed as issues of Native workers' rights. And the term indigenous wasn't used until a 1952 study. That was the first time the term was used. Although the perspective it had was a very assimilationist perspective, which took the idea that Native cultures were inevitably going to be assimilated or disappear. And then two documents I'm going to talk about are Convention number 107 and Convention number 169, and they both deal with indigenous rights. So Convention number 107, which was called the Indigenous and Tribal Populations Convention of 1957, its goal was to provide for the dignified assimilation of indigenous people. It was the first piece of international legislation to deal specifically with indigenous peoples, and it inevitably reflected the prevailing political and philanthropic attitude of the times, in which the assimilation of primitive or backward cultures was seen as the first necessary step for the prosperity and liberation of their individual members. So in 1989, the Convention number 196, which is full name is actually the Concerning Indigenous and Tribal Peoples in Independent Countries. The purpose of that, in large part, was to correct the assimilationist perspective of the 1957 convention. And the ruling theme of this convention can be found in its preamble, where it states that it recognizes the aspirations of these people to exercise control over their own institutions, ways of life, and economic development, and to maintain and develop their identities, languages, and religions within the framework of the states in which they live. So one thing which I find important is that during the course of the development of this convention, there was debate over whether to use the term peoples or populations, and most states didn't want to use the term peoples because of its association with self-determination, and in other international laws, that was associated with the right to independent statehood. So a lot of states didn't want to use the term peoples because then it elevated indigenous peoples to the same level as the state. So instead, what happened was there was a compromise. They left the term peoples in, but they put this in, sort of to qualify it. The use of the term peoples in this convention shall not be construed as having any implications as regard the rights which may attach to the term under international law. So, to date, 22 countries have ratified it. Argentina did so in 2000. Chile finally did in 2008. And the U.S. Has not, is one of the countries that have not. So the convention met with a lot of disappointment by indigenous peoples who felt it was an opportunity to accomplish a lot more than it did and it has. Two of the most glaring deficiencies were the lack of strong wording, particularly in reference to the self-determination, and also the inaccessibility of the complaint procedures. Indigenous communities and indigenous organizations do not have the right to file complaints to the ILO on their own. They need some sort of intermediary. And this is because the complaint procedures involve a tripartite structure in which representation is built around an exclusive balance of state, corporate, and labor interests. So as of 2009, only 7 representations have been accepted and reviewed by the governing body of the ILO. And in the first representation, they wanted to make clear and set a precedent that their purpose is not to be a land claims court, which is often a lot of the disputes and issues with indigenous people involve land. So the ILO wanted to make sure that that wasn't what they were there for. So as a result, a lot of indigenous peoples and communities have shifted their focus to the parent organization of the UN, and specifically the UN Commission on Human Rights, and then the UN Human Rights Council, which in 2006 replaced it. So now turning to the UN Declaration of Rights on Indigenous Peoples, which was 22 years in the making. This document focuses on protecting the cultural distinctiveness of indigenous peoples, and the directive to draft the declaration was established in 1985. The first complete draft was finished in 1988. The final draft was finished in 1993, and after substantial amendments required by member states, it was finally adopted in September of 2007, with an overwhelming support of most of the member nations of the UN. 143 voted to adopt it, 11 chose from abstaining, and 4 chose against its adoption, and those 4 that chose against it were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. And for the United States, their reasoning was there was a lot of unclear and confusing language in the document, especially concerning self-determination. But one of the most notable aspects of the declaration is that the rights holders themselves had significant input into the drafting and what went into the declaration. So while these international documents, the ILO Convention and the Declaration on Indigenous Rights, have aided indigenous peoples in achieving rights and recognition, it's important to examine the legal status and the authority that they have, because the most important thing to recognize is they're not international law. And really, the only authority the General Assembly has is to make recommendations to the member states, to those who ratified the convention or adopted the declaration. So they're not like treaties, which states individually commit to being bound to through formal means of acceptance. So the UN declarations are not legally binding. Now, it's been argued that they can be considered a kind of soft law, where they can be seen as embodying or providing an authoritative interpretation of norms that are already legally binding in other pieces of international law. Although, as I'll talk about a little bit later, this idea or theory of soft law really doesn't have very much relevance in the real world. So now I just want to talk briefly about the UN Human Rights Council, which is one of the ways the member states are held accountable to these documents. And one of its main responsibilities is the Universal Periodic Review. And this is where a special rapporteur reviews how each state is fulfilling its human rights obligations and its commitment to indigenous, not indigenous, just its human rights obligation. Because actually, while the Universal Periodic Review, it doesn't specifically target indigenous rights. Although when it goes into a country where there's a population which is considered indigenous, then it does become part of the review. So Chile underwent its periodic review in 2009, and its special rapporteur was James Anaya. And in the report of his review, Anaya acknowledges the advancement of the Chilean state's recognition of indigenous rights, particularly in 2 areas: the 2008 ratification of the Convention 169, and initiatives being taken to revise the Constitution to include the indigenous peoples in their country. Now, when I was there in 2007 in Chile, it seemed of high importance to a lot of the people I talked to that Chile needed to ratify this convention because they hadn't ratified it. It had been around for forever. They couldn't believe they hadn't ratified it. But when I was back there this past year, there was a notable lack of enthusiasm over it, and the people I talked to didn't have any hope, really, that it would make a whole lot of change. And in the 2 years since it's been ratified, it doesn't seem to have influenced much policy decisions in any way. So while Anaya was able to identify some areas that Chile has progressed and improved regarding indigenous rights, he found a lot of areas of concern where it has not fulfilled its duties. And some of those areas of concern included the lack of political participation by indigenous peoples, the lack of communication with indigenous peoples while implementing development projects, which is really important, the lack of a specific mechanism for recognizing indigenous land and resource rights, the fragmentation of traditional territories when they buy land and redistribute it to Mapuche in an attempt to reparation for the seized lands of previous decades. Also, continued discrimination and inequality of the indigenous people and excessive force and violence used in the Mapuche communities by law enforcement officers. So one area of concern that he found that I want to discuss, is the use of the anti-terrorist law, which was passed under the Pinochet regime, in the prosecution of Mapuche activists with legitimate land claims issues. And implementing this law can include anything from being held without trial or in a trial, the use of anonymous witnesses. So the defense and the defendant have no idea who these witnesses are. They could be anybody saying anything. And also the inclusion of evidence in which the defense attorneys have no access to. And there's been at least 15, I know, 15 Mapuche activists that have been prosecuted using this law. So during Chile's 2003 Universal Periodic Review, the Special Rapporteur at the time recommended that the law be reviewed and revised because the term terrorist was too broadly defined. In Chile's response to that review, Chile agreed, said that they would, that yes, it needed to be reviewed and revised. But in the 2009 review, Anaya expressed the concern that no reviews had taken place. So with this example, it becomes apparent that the recommendations put forth by the UN pretty much states have the option to follow them or not, with no real repercussions except perhaps in the global reputation. So now I want to turn to the Chilean national law, which is the 1993 indigenous law. This was after the first administration after Pinochet. The Special Commission on Indigenous Peoples was created, and it proposed 3 initiatives, the first being a law which addressed the demands of the indigenous peoples in their country, in Chile. The second was ratification of the ILO Convention number 169, and third was a revision of the Constitution. And at the time, the only one that was approved was the indigenous law. So in October 1993, it was passed, although with significant modifications to what had been proposed. The principal elements of the law included right to political participation, representation, protection of indigenous land, the right to cultural and linguistic freedom, and the obligation of the state to help develop economic and socially marginalized indigenous communities. So the indigenous law has been considered a giant step forward with respect to previous laws on the same subject, since it is very plainly stated that its purpose is to protect indigenous peoples. Nevertheless, it's lacking in many areas, most notably its use of vague and unspecific language. Nowhere in the law is there an acknowledgement of indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, and also nowhere in the law is there actual reference to indigenous peoples at all. They use the term etnia, which is ethnic group. So instead of indigenous peoples, it's indigenous ethnic groups, which sort of falls back on the same discussion that they had with the problem with the UN document. The law also fails to address indigenous subsoil rights and mineral rights, customary rights, and indigenous women's rights. And the law is best summed up by Isolde Reuque in When a Flower is Reborn. She said that if the indigenous law is helping us recover indigenous lands, through other law, the state is taking away indigenous lands for highways, hydroelectric dams, mining concessions, for whatever it wants. So they have this law which sometimes goes in contrast to other things the government wants to do, and when that happens, they pretty much just ignore it. And several people that I talked to in Chile kind of half-jokingly kind of explained the dialogue that goes on with this law, because the law says that if the government wants to take the land for some project, hydroelectric dam or whatever, they have to advise and consult the Mapuche people. And Mapuche that I talked to sort of jokingly said, yeah, it says they can consult, but they don't have to, they don't need our permission. They can just do whatever they want. So they come, they tell us we're going to do this. What do you think? We tell them what they think, and they're like, okay, good, but you still have to leave because we're still going to do this. So the law says something, but the way the wording is kind of makes it so that it's completely irrelevant in a lot of cases. And also with the Bio Dam project, from the past decade, there was some cases that wanted to go to court, and the Chilean courts just, the judges did not want to touch it, so they just refused to hear the cases. So there's this law which doesn't seem to be very effective a lot of times. But I would like to point out that both the ILO Convention number 169 and the Indigenous Law charge the Chilean state with the obligation to create development projects that benefit marginalized Mapuche communities. So I'm going to turn to this concept now of development or desarrollo because I think it's an important term, and I'm going to use the word desarrollo through the rest of the presentation because I feel like development improperly translates some of the intersections of meaning that occur in the Latin American world, because there's some terms that are used like multiculturalism and the word interculturalidad, which is interculturality, which I don't even think is an English word. Like, they don't mean the same things in Latin America that they mean in English, so I'm using desarrollo. So throughout my research, I found 6 different variations on the term desarrollo. Subdesarrollo, desarrollo endógamo, desarrollo local, which is very popular in Latin America and especially Mexico. Desarrollo rural, and desarrollo con identidad, which means desarrollo, development with identity, which is very commonly used among Mapuche communities. So there's no one theory or concept or definition of desarrollo, and even those that do exist can be broken down even further. One scholar breaks down desarrollo local, which is local development, into the economic, the political, institutional, and local identity. So when the government goes to institute development projects without exploring in any way the theories on development, or especially communicating with the Mapuche communities as to what they feel they need or feel what would benefit their communities, it can lead to wasted money, ineffective programs, and even the destruction of Mapuche territory, which is what the programs are supposed to be preventing in the first place. So first, I want to just have a quick look at the Chilean neoliberal political perspective of desarrollo, especially as it relates to Western worldview. And then I want to contrast it with the Mapuche conception of desarrollo and how it relates to their worldview. So for the Chilean government, the concept of desarrollo is almost exclusively limited to the economic, which means their projects focus on things like providing small monetary subsidies, establishing small businesses, diversifying production, and commercializing local industries like fishing. And their understanding comes from a very capitalist perspective. And the worldview, Western worldview, contributes in particular to their concept of desarrollo. And that worldview is dominated by visual and tactile perception. What is taken for reality is what can be seen, and what is defined by the evidence of our eyes. So our worldview, Western worldview, is very much on the objective, what we can observe. And often what happens with that is it creates an understanding based on separation or fragmentation. So we sort of like reason versus intuition, subject versus object, mind versus body, culture versus nature. So with that perspective, when we're dealing with human culture and human advancement, as separate from, it's viewed separately from in the environment, and what happens is natural resources are viewed as objects, things to be enjoyed and used for gain. As David Pete puts it in his book, Blackfoot Physics, Western reality with its focus on material surface does not have room for spirits, angels, fleas, souls, or the inner nature of apples. I like the way he put that. So natural resources, products, and even human resources are treated as capital. And often Mapuche people themselves are viewed as objects in the same way that natural resources are viewed as objects. And that, for example, the Mapuche small business owner becomes an object in the capitalist economic system of the country. So the Mapuche people stand in sharp contrast to this commodified version of land and individuals. And if Western worldview can be defined by its emphasis on separation and fragmentation, the Mapuche worldview can be contrasted with that by examining its holistic perspective and its emphasis on unity and equilibrium. And while it's this scope of this paper only allows me to barely scratch the surface of Mapuche worldview, which is very complicated, I'm going to focus on two different concepts which have something to do with desarrollo or development, and those are Mapu and Comefelen. So the word Mapuche literally means people of the land, Mapu and Che. But translating Mapu as land or even territory, which is often how it's translated, really doesn't even begin to convey the depth of meaning that exists in the native term. A closer definition would be that Mapu is the material and immaterial spaces where the diverse dimensions of everyday Mapuche life are manifested. Or another way of putting it would be that the Mapu makes up the nearby and functional spaces that contribute to the social construction of reality and the social construction found in everyday Mapuche reality. So in this space, in this Mapu, there's a number of beings which inhabit it, beings, entities, powers that all communicate and circulate through these spaces. Newen are powers that are associated with people and entities. Every Che, every person has a Newen associated with him or her. Nyen are what can be described as spirit masters of wild nature whose role is to care, protect, shield, and watch over, through balance, continuity, and well-being, the elements under their care. So for the Mapu, the environment and all its elements are alive, always in movement and totally active, which is a different perspective that we often have in our Western perspective. The Mapuche concept of Comefelen is the closest approximation of desarrollo that exists in Mapudungun, the native language of the Mapuche. It takes a much more holistic and communal perspective than the Western concept, and it's also usually described as a state of being or a future vision of a state of being, and it can literally be translated as well-being. This concept has been defined as the state of individual and collective well-being that gives to one's existence a relationship of social, environmental, and cultural equilibrium. Comefelen is the state in which a person reaches well-being in all areas of one's life. It is a complex process that begins with a profound transformation of worldview, which involves finding a balance and is reflected in events such as solidarity, mutual aid, practices, and traditions. So Mapuche understanding of desarrollo is intricately intertwined with their concept of the Mapu, or the environment, the space they inhabit. Their collective sense of Comefelen, which is opposed to individual, is very collective, and they're finding equilibrium between the two. So improper use of natural resources or disrespect of the elements that exist in the Mapu can create diseases and conflicts. So when the Chilean government goes about implementing these projects of desarrollo, they focus on these individualistic capitalist enterprises, which often exploit natural resources, which is very much opposed to Mapuche culture, Mapuche worldview, and what Mapuche feel for themselves will create a sense of well-being, that sense of development. Right, so it's important, what's important in Mapuche communities is equilibrium with their environment, communal efforts, and shared success, and the maintenance of cultural traditions. So for them, when they're developing a desarrollo or development project, these would be the sorts of things they're looking at instead of what the state thinks that the Mapuche need, which really all it does is the state projects, without consulting or communicating with the Mapuche, really all it does is try to make them like other Chileans, I think. And when the state is implementing projects which aren't necessarily related to indigenous rights, things that they, call progress, infrastructure, highways, these things can actually have very detrimental effects on Mapuche communities, including just south of Temuco, where I was living, there's a highway that they decided to put right through this one community. So half the community is on one side of the highway, another half of the community is on the other side of the highway, and people have to cross this highway back and forth. This busy highway, old women have to crawl under the median, and people die there all the time. So many Mapuche have been killed at that spot since the highway has been built, or through disease. There's another instance where there's there's a dump from Temuco's refuge goes to this dump, which is right next to a Mapuche community, and they have a lot of problem with disease there for obvious reasons. So, and these things are presented as progress by the Chilean government, and even kind of shamefully, publicly, the president of Chile, the old president, Bachelet, she has publicized that these projects and represent progress, and that the people of the community are pleased by them, which, if you count the Mapuche community, is completely not true. So, in conclusion, I just want to propose two solutions, which may or may not be terribly realistic, but which I think will help the situation in Chile. The first is for the Chilean government to set aside their colonial ideology, which allows them to institute policies under the guise of protecting indigenous rights, but in fact still attempts to assimilate and integrate them into mainstream society. And there needs to be an honest effort at intercultural communication and cooperation in order to find a way where indigenous rights can be respected without sacrificing national progress and national development. And the second, and more generally speaking, and also not terribly realistic in the current international political atmosphere, I think, is that these documents, the ILO Convention number 169 and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they should be elevated to the status of law. Because that way, when recommendations are made, the states in which they're recommended to are legally required to hold to them. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And as I mentioned earlier at the start of our panel presentation, our third panelist is not able to be here with us directly, but she has sent on her paper. That is Dr. Maria Effendi, Assistant Professor, Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the National Defense University in Islamabad, Pakistan. And I'm very humbled to be reading for her today. The title of her piece is The Role of the United Nations in Interstate Conflicts, a Case Study of Kashmir. And in her introduction, she explains that the role of international organizations is crucial to bringing peace, ensuring harmonious relations amongst countries, developing economic prospects and opportunities among developed and developing countries, and to settle/look after world conflicts. The United Nations has been playing an important role in dealing with the contemporary conflicts in the post-World War II era. It has been dealing with the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir right from the very beginning since 1947. India and Pakistan obtained independence from British colonialism in 1947. The two countries have a history of differences over various issues since independence, such as threat perceptions between the two armed forces and arms proliferation and so on. Kashmir, is one of the main conflicts. India and Pakistan fought three major wars in 1948, 1965, and 1971, and two of those were fought over Kashmir, those in 1948 and 1965. There were several low-intensity military adventures between India and Pakistan over the same conflict throughout the last 6 decades as well. Kashmir acquired the recognition/status of being an international conflict with the involvement of the United Nations in 1948. And here we come to the theme that runs through our 3 panel presentations here, is the role of the UN, in various case studies around the world. And Dr. Effendi's paper assesses the role of the United Nations in the Kashmir conflict as a peacemaker and as a peacekeeper. It also deals with the question of the efficiency an international organization like the UN could have displayed to help resolve/manage the Kashmir conflict, and found that lacking. The paper evaluates the function of the United Nations military and observer group in India and Pakistan as an international monitoring mission for the most dangerous conflict zone in South Asia, Kashmir. It focuses exclusively on the specific role of the United Nations in restoring peace between India and Pakistan. An overview would also is given in the paper on how the UN could have played a better role to fulfill and expand the functions and mandate of the mission. Now, Kashmir has been a disputed territory between India and Pakistan since the day of their independence, in August of '47. Since then, the relationships between the two countries were based on colonial legacy as well as historical acrimony. The region is known for the history of tense relations, continuous series of border clashes, and limited or large-scale wars between these two neighbors. The borders of Kashmir are surrounded by Indian Punjab, by the Pakistani frontier province, Pakistani-occupied Kashmir, and also the presence of China. The former princely state is approximately 86,000 square miles, of which 30,000 is administered by Pakistan, 39,000 by India, and 17,000 by China. The majority of the Kashmiri population living within India resides in the Kashmir Valley, about 5.4 million people. The majority of the population of Kashmir consists of Muslims, whereas Hindus and Buddhists, right, are in the minority. The role of the United Nations. The UN has played two types of roles in the Kashmir conflict. It established immediate ceasefire as a peacemaker, right, and monitored the activities of Indian and Pakistani forces as a peacekeeper, right, that is the United Nations military and observer group, right, between India and Pakistan, which much of her paper is focused on. In January of 1948, under Article 35 of the United Nations Charter, India took the case before the Security Council regarding the ownership of Kashmir, right, and they charged Pakistan with assisting tribesmen and other invaders, right, to violating the sovereignty of India in the region of Pakistan. Pakistan equally accused India to take of taking Kashmir illegally, as the ratification, right, of an instrument of accession, right, was not done by the people of Kashmir, as per the rule of accession. The UN intervened to manage the crisis and adopted a resolution, right, in January of that year, 48. And under that resolution, right, the United Nations Commission, right, for India and Pakistan was suggested. And this was composed of three representatives, right? One from India, one from Pakistan, and a third member to be designated by those two selected from India and Pakistan. And this body passed two resolutions in 48 and 49 respectively. According to the resolutions, right, both India and Pakistan agreed to the cessation of fighting, the demilitarization of the state of Kashmir, and the holding of an impartial plebiscite under the administrator nominated by the United Nations. The function of this UN mission was extended to other tasks as well, right, engaging observers, right, to monitor and stop the fighting between the two countries over the borders of Kashmir. Okay. On July 26 of 49, the ceasefire line, right, the CFL, right, for the whole of the 800-mile front, right, in the Jammu Kashmir area, was agreed to by India and Pakistan in a conference, right, mediated by the United Nations and military representatives of the two dominions. This agreement, known as the Karachi Agreement, facilitated by Britain and the United Nations, right, the resolutions didn't bring a permanent solution to Kashmir, yet it did prevent India and Pakistan from war until 1965. And here is, one of the areas in which Dr. Effendi establishes a limited success for the United Nations in the history of the Kashmiri conflict, and that it is able not to completely create a sustainable peace, but to create periods of peace between conflict. The United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan was established in January 49 to monitor the activities of Indian and Pakistani forces along the border state. Okay, and it was established to observe the activities and mobilization, right, along the line of control, and then its powers were expanded, as time went by. In 65, right, again, a second war between the two countries broke out, right, and as a result of a series of skirmishes since April of 65, and then India launched an attack onto Pakistan-administered Kashmir, and by crossing the ceasefire line. The attack by India was in retaliation, right, to Operation Gibraltar, right, orchestrated by Pakistani to infiltrate massively into Kashmir. Okay, so there's a cycle of violence that she establishes here in the piece. Indian armed forces attacked Pakistan, crossing the international border, and declared an all-out war. This lasted for 5 weeks and was ended with a UN-mandated ceasefire, which came into effect as a result of the Security Council's resolution. Okay. Now, her critical assessment of the UN mission in Kashmir, right, the UN has played its role in Kashmir conflict through various groups. Among all, right, the only existing mission at this point is the United Nations Military and Observer Group, right, on the border, right, which is a peacekeeping mission, right, that had no role in peace building, right, or the creation of human security, or looking after human security in Kashmir. It manages its finances, right, under a regular UN budget of $7.92 million, right, and it is still at work. It has 44 military observers from Sweden, Denmark, Chile, right, Finland, Croatia, Italy, the Republic of Korea, right, as well as Uruguay. It has 21 international civilian personnel and a local 49-member civilian staff. Well, in her paper, she goes on, right, to talk about some of the promising features, right, of this group's continuing work, right, and that it has prevented India and Pakistan from having an all-out war, right, between certain chunks of the post-war period. although, as she establishes, right, the two countries experience negative peace, right, and there are continuous border clashes and tension along the ceasefire line, right, but there's no exchange of heavy bombing, right, and there has been less saber rattling between India and Pakistan because of the work of the United Nations Military and Observer Group. Well, in terms of recommendations, right, she's argued that the United Nations Military and Observer Group can go beyond being a peacekeeping organization, and it has a responsibility to expand its mandate into becoming a peace-building organization. And her paper lays out a variety of things that ought to be considered, right, involved in human security as issues of conflict resolution in the region of Kashmir. Okay. UN peacekeeping missions may function on humanitarian grounds, addressing human rights violations in light of international humanitarian law. The legal capacity of the United Nations to bear international rights and obligations as an attribute, right, of its international legal personality, right, has been recognized by the International Court of Justice. Okay, so the paper goes on to identify a few areas where the Military and Observer Group of the UN could have managed to work, but it did not, right, and they are, right, humanitarian services for Kashmiris, right, which she finds very lacking rather, in the UN's work in Kashmir. Help to build an economic infrastructure, crisis management and conflict prevention in other issues that are not directly related to Kashmir but worsen bilateral relations between India and Pakistan. Involvement of other regional and international organizations in economic and social welfare. And she proposes several things in the paper that bring this into more detail, right? For example, all right, to focus on gender-related issues, which again is very lacking in the UN's work in the region of Kashmir. So she argues that the Military and Observer Group, its power should be expanded, and it should focus on gender issues of Kashmir by involving women activists and organizations. Kashmiri women have been suffering for a very long time, she notes, and they are not only victimized by the militants and infiltrators, but are also victimized by representatives of the armed forces, both of India and Pakistan. Okay, and yet, if their advocacy, right, could be expanded, right, then they could become a great force for a sustainable peace in the region. Okay. She also argues that the United Nations Military and Observer Group in India and Pakistan should review and revise its mandate annually. Right, the region and domestic political dynamics have been changing for the past 58 years. The prevailing bilateral relations between India and Pakistan are fairly better than in the past, and there are less chances of war between the two in the near future. The United Nations should include a few more tasks in the mandate to help the peace building in Kashmir. And again, these are just some of the proposals, right, that she has laid out. And because of time constraints, I won't go into more detail into her work, but it is fascinating. And she asked me if there are questions, right, I can certainly put any of you in touch with her right through email, and she'd be very pleased to respond to your questions or concerns about her work. Okay. And so with a few minutes here, I thought we might take a few questions of our panelists, Dr. Vray and Marilyn Andrews. So if there are any questions, perhaps they'll come up or they can keep their seats, and I'll bring the mic over.
Marilyn, I just had a question. I think most Americans are familiar with Mayans, Indian, Incas, and Aztecs from public education. I'm not familiar with the Mapuche. And how many people identify themselves as Mapuche? What are their territorial claims, and how does that affect, Argentina, the other citizens of Argentina and Chile, in trying to resolve those things?
Well, first of all, how big the population of the Mapuche people are is a very difficult question to answer because it entirely depends on your definition of Mapuche and which census you're using. Because between the 1992 and the 2000 census, there was a huge jump in the number of people who identified as Mapuche, and partly it was a change in terminology of what they used. But I think generally you could say there's about 10 million Mapuche who live in the country of Chile. Most of them, 60% of them, live in Santiago. 40% of them live in the territories to the south, the river Biobío, and south to the lakes regions. And then the comparable area on the Argentine side. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, it was how much land they actually
Yes,
claim
right.
compared to those two countries.
Right.
And how does that affect the citizens of
Well, most of the land that they claim as their own, there are small farmers. It's not very developed land. I mean, the problem is that the land is good for certain things like mining, or the forestry industry is huge. It's a huge industry in Chile. And what that does actually is especially with the eucalyptus and the pine and stuff, it depletes a lot of the minerals and the water from the soil. So that has an effect on Mapuche, who are still in a lot of ways a subsistence culture. And in Argentina, part of the problem, at least in the area that I went to, which was around Bariloche, is it's a very touristy area. There's a lot of pretty lakes and pretty environments, which the Chilean or the Argentine government either wants to use for tourism, or rich Argentines or rich foreigners come in and buy up the land. And then that's actually a problem both for the Mapuche and the poor people who live in the area, because they don't have access to the natural resources, and it's also hard for the poor non-Mapuche people in that area to be able to forge a life for themselves in that area. So in general, I definitely think that there's enough land for both what the Mapuche people need and for what the Chilean people need. Part of the problem in that region is Temuco. I went there for the first time in 1998, and it seemed like a very small town. And I went there again in 2000, and it was an entirely different town. It had grown up. It's one of the fastest growing cities in South America. So that's another one of the problems. It's just that, and it keeps expanding and expanding to these territories where the Mapuche were there, and now they're being like kind of eaten up by the town. And some of the lofts, the traditional Mapuche communities, are now actually inside the city of Temuco, where before they weren't. So I hope that answers your question.
Time for one more question in the back here.
Dr. Vray, I was wondering if the African Union or any of the other regional African organizations were approaching the landward side of the maritime security threat.
Right. A departure for the whole problem that they're having offshore is that it originates from land. If you have so-called ungoverned spaces on land, eventually you're going to have ungoverned spaces at sea, for the simple reason, historically, the argument is man has always taken his conflicts to the sea, and why should this be different? So what you have is that, of course, you had the Ethiopian invasion, and they, against all expectations, they routed the Al-Shabaab, because the Al-Shabaab got their strategy wrong. What happened was they couldn't stay there, too much politics involved. They began to withdraw. The transitional federal government moved in from Kenya, where it was housed. But somebody had to take care of the security and be a type of a backup for the transitional federal government, because the setup was clan-based. There was no government. And then the African Union called upon the member states of the African Union, and they formed AMISOM. And AMISOM is predominantly comprised of Ugandans, and if I'm correct, Burundi? I think from Burundi, predominantly, and that they run the show. Very recently, IGAD, a regional organization that covers the Horn of Africa, they committed themselves to up the strength of African Union soldiers in Somalia itself. But that did not materialize as of yet. So what you in fact have is that the African Union responded to a call by the United Nations to put at least some soldiers, but not near to the number of soldiers they had to put down. to try and contain the escalating and violence. But in the context of Somalia, we must understand that AMISOM from the African Union hardly manages to operate beyond Mogadishu, and that they, together with the transitional federal government, only manage to control a number of blocks of Mogadishu city, and not much beyond that. It's really very, very difficult. But from the angle of the United Nations, they realized that you cannot let the offshore domain collapse in a total bad order at sea. Because your good order at sea says you must be able to exploit the ocean, you must use it to traverse, you must withdraw food from the ocean, you must have dominion on the ocean, and you must use the ocean for information and communication. And you cannot, in such a crucial maritime hub, let that just go down the drain because of the crucial global sea routes that run for trade and oil that run through there. And that was why the United Nations stepped in my mind, from the maritime side as well, although the United Nations is not known for doing well at sea. And coming up with peace support operations from the sea, but the link between the two here is that it became almost inevitable. You cannot do the one without the other, and the surprising part is how countries, how organizations, the UN, the European Union, NATO, task forces comprising different countries and individual countries formed maritime task forces that are operating off the coast, through the Gulf of Aden, into the Red Sea, into that barrier, and then even down as far south as the problem stretches down to Mauritius, etc., towards Madagascar. And so you really, the securitization process brought in the maritime side, but it's really much more complex on land, and people are more familiar with the complexity on land, but not so familiar about the things that are happening offshore.
All right, well, thank you once again to our panelists in this session. And I see that I got a nod there from Chef Luba, right, to let me know that the lunch for the conference is laid out back in the banquet.